I have to say that I am offended, if not completely insulted, by Steelrising. Not the game itself, I must add. I'm offended by Steelrising, as in, I'm offended by the name. I'm outraged. Outraged, I tells ya, that such an off-puttingly generic title has been attached to a game about a robot in a powdered wig. You can't give me an ornately engraved Parisian robot girl pit against a clockwork army of Baroque automatons and wrap the whole affair up with a name so sodding nondescript. Steelrising is about as mainstream video game title.exe as you could chuffing well get. And it's set in Paris around Revolution times. As someone said to me the other day, Bastille is right there. Come on, video games, get it the fuck together. So anyway, this is Steelrising, a game that, unlike its title, actually stands out quite a bit. It's an action RPG that takes on the by now well-worn framework of the Soulslike. You face off against challenging enemies, challenging on paper anyway, attacking with shoulder buttons because that's what a FromSoft game does. When you respawn, you leave your collected experience/currency on the ground where you died, and the interwoven maps feature checkpoints that respawn all the enemies upon use. You know the deal by now. As much as I love a good Souls-like, I have been starting to get burnt out on them, to the point where a title needs to really stand out to keep my attention. Fortunately for Steelrising, my attention has very much been maintained. Steelrising stands out in a number of ways. There's its engaging fluidity of combat, its strong aesthetic and basic premise, and the fact that you can create some hilariously broken builds. Edging toward the Bloodborne end of the Bloodborne to Dark Souls spectrum, it tends to reward fast-paced aggression over slow, methodical tactics. That's not to say you can't build a defensive character, though interestingly, shields are tied to certain weapons as special abilities, rather than feature as their own separate equipment. What this means is that if you want a certain weapon, you're very much going to have to adopt a specific playstyle to suit it. The slate of weapons on offer are pretty cool. There are bladed fans that you can dance around enemies with, a suite of exotic elemental weaponry, a giant-sized pocket watch that you can batter enemies to death with, and my personal favourite, a rifle that shoots ice bullets. So let's talk about those broken builds. There are a number of basic character classes you start with, though you can level into any sort of build you like once you start acquiring experience. During the beta I went with the Dancer, which starts with the fans, and is very much a dex build. But for the final release, I went with the Alchemist. This game's approximation of a mage-type character. The Alchemist is centered around dealing elemental damage, and let me tell you, Steelrising doesn't fuck around when it comes to said damage. It's one of the things I really like about it. A lot of games love to nerf the more interesting special damage types, especially as the game progresses. This is presumably for balancing issues, but balance in Steelrising is very much a non-issue. It doesn't give a shit. I mentioned that rifle that shoots icy bullets. If something takes enough ice damage, it will freeze, rendering it immobile and vulnerable to a huge slate of attacks, falling over with a big chunk taken off its health bar once enough damage has been dealt. Yeah, it takes a couple of shots from the rifle to freeze almost anything, up to and including massive bosses. Once it's frozen, you can charge in with a second equipped weapon and hack the fuck out of it. I coupled my rifle with those aforementioned fiery shotgun tonfas, and let me tell you, once you set something alight, it tends to suffer a buggering flick load of damage over time. Now, elemental damage is balanced somewhat by the need for alchemical capsules, though they regularly drop from enemies and can be bought in shops. And naturally, there are enemies with elemental resistances. I am in fact at a boss right now that is resistant to all elemental damage, which is actually forcing me to play the game with a modicum of skill. Oh dear. But for the most part, my build is broken. Brilliantly broken. Some might be upset by the lack of challenge that certain builds can provide. But if you want to feel entertainingly overpowered, this game's got you covered. That's not to say there isn't plenty of fun engaging with the combat in, let's say, good faith. It takes a little getting used to because a lot of enemies have fairly good tracking and really wide attack patterns. But once you get used to how the various robotic opponents work and move, you can find that the game is really rewarding when it comes to dodging attacks and launching a speedy counter-offensive. There are some thoroughly delightful attack animations for the protagonist, Aegis. Or was it Aegis? And there's a real sense of combat flow. Dodging is really responsive, and when you attack off the back of an evasive maneuver, Aegis will slide back into combat with a really fluid attack. Now there is a stamina system governing one's attacks, dodges, blocks and counters, and when I first played the game I thought that stamina drained far too quickly, even with the gimmick attached. However, once I got used to the gimmick, I have to say I enjoy stamina management in this game more than others, though that's not saying too much because I fucking hate stamina management. While it behaves the same way as any other stamina meter, Aegis is, at the end of the day, a robot. When the stamina meter drains, she overheats, becoming incapable of performing certain actions until she cools down. Here's where that gimmick comes in. You can initiate an instant cooldown by pressing a button after you overheat. The quicker you press it, the more stamina you regain. Essentially, your stamina meter can be doubled if you press the button immediately after you burn out. The trade-off is that each time you initiate an instant cooldown, you acquire a portion of frost damage. Now theoretically, you can initiate that cooldown multiple times, but if you do it too many times, you will freeze and become just as vulnerable as anything else that's frozen. It's a neat little trick that makes stamina management far more engaging than in most other games. So yeah, I kind of like it. And overall, I kind of love this game. Now many of you know me, I like camp fanciness. So the Baroque 18th century Parisian aesthetic to Steelrising is what got my attention. I adore the design of the protagonist and I love the various armor pieces you can find for her throughout the game. They're really fancy. You can get a tricorn hat or a big floppy one. I love big floppy ones. I dig the enemy designs. Many of them have ornate carvings, appear as animate statues or intimidating behemoths. There's a light steampunkiness to the aesthetic, although the Revolution-era Parisian look gives it its own unique identity. Now all this said, there are some significant flaws. First of all, this is a spiders game. If you're familiar with spiders, you already have an idea of just how janky this thing can be. Spiders is the studio responsible for such titles as The Technomancer, Mars Warlogs, and most popularly Greedfall. All their games are ambitious as hell, boast a whole bunch of unique lore, try their absolute hardest, all while giving us bad dialogue, worse voice acting, tepid graphics, and outright breakages. Now, my very first impression of Steelrising was terrible. In fact, I've got footage of it. Here's what I was dealing with. No, YouTube was not screwing up on you, your internet is just fine, nothing's buffering, that's just how Steelrising started. And I'm sad to say it's happened a few times while I've been playing. A level of stuttering that has at times rendered the game more or less unplayable. This seems to happen most often when the game loads a new area, and while it clears up on its own after time, it can take a long time. The game also features a puzzling amount of missing voiced dialogue. Pay attention to subtitles because sometimes lines simply won't be said among all the voiced ones. My other big disappointment with this game is the story. The idea of the kings setting up an indefatigable clockwork army in the face of the French Revolution is a bloody fertile ground for narrative, but it simply doesn't capitalise on any of that. Instead, focusing on the intrigue of some nobles who I don't give a fuck about, as Steelrising becomes preoccupied with a whole bunch of mystical bullshit. It's a shame because there's some promising stuff. Near the start of the game, you find a whole bunch of dead soldiers because they were killed and replaced by automata. I really hoped we'd get into some class struggle, dare I say, some politics. But no, mystical bullshit. I mean, I know spiders would have handled it clumsily, but in a way, isn't that part of the appeal of a spider's game? Still, it's done little to halt my enjoyment of Steelrising. It's by far the most polished, and the best put together of Spider's work to date. Overall, it's an immensely enjoyable Soulslike that does just enough to stand out in a sea of the things. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go back to face the boss that's laughing at my ice rifle. I am in for a rough morning without that.